Hello everyone, this is Jeff with Mississippi and the Civil War. Hope you're all having a great weekend. It's a beautiful day and I have been thoroughly enjoying it. And today I wanted to talk about Civil War relics, a subject that's near and dear to my heart. I've been a collector of Civil War relics for as long as I can remember. I've been buying since I was a little kid, and around here, where I grew up in central Mississippi, Civil War relics were not hard to find. You have battlefields everywhere. You've got the Battle of Port Gibson, the Battle of Champion Hill, the Battle of Raymond, the Battle of Big Black River, the Battle of Jackson, the Siege of Vicksburg. So relics were not hard to find. So I began amassing a collection at a very young age. I started pretty modestly with little things like a piece of canister shot I bought at a flea market for 50 cents, or the Union button that I bought, I think, for a quarter. I've had relics in my life, literally for just about all my life. And this is not something new. Relics of the late unpleasantness, as we might say, have always had the power to transport people back to that momentous time in our nation's history. And holding something just as simple as, a lowly little mini ball can help you to time travel back to places like Manassas or Sharpsburg or Vicksburg, the battlefields where our nation's history were written in blood. And this fascination with Civil War relics is nothing new. It's been going on literally while it started while the war was still going on. And it continues right through to today. And I'm just going to talk about how the love of relics has kind of been a constant through the history of this area. And I really got to dive deep into relics when I worked at the Old Courthouse Museum in Vicksburg, Mississippi. I was fortunate enough to work there for 9.5 years. I was there from 1996 to 2005, and they were some of the best years of my life. For a historian, particularly one interested in the Civil War, there was no better place to be. I was in a building that just reeked of Civil War history. In fact, you could say it was etched into the very bones of the building. Literally, if you go around to the backside, some of the slates, the flooring for the outside of the building, they literally have soldiers' names, initials, and units carved into them. Just like this soldier from Company H of the 45th Illinois Infantry carved his initials and his unit into the building. There are a number of those. So you couldn't help but absorb a love for Civil War relics being in a place like that for so long. And fortunately, while I was at the old courthouse, I spent many an hour pouring through old records and newspapers and letters and documents. And you'd be surprised how many documents talk about Civil War artifacts. And what follows are just some of the interesting little stories about artifacts that I've run across in my years. And I hope you enjoy it. I know I will. Now, one of the earliest depictions of an artifact I found in print came in July 1861. The citizens of Vicksburg at that time were electrified by the news of the Southern victory at the Battle of First Manassas. August 9th, 1861, the Vicksburg Daily Whig announced to its readers that it had a genuine war relic of that battle to show to the public. And the article stated, "A trophy. We received yesterday from General Patridge by Adams Express a musket barrel, picked up on the Manassas battlefield by Mr. Vincent Corey, a member of the Volunteer Southrons. They were Company A of the 21st Mississippi Infantry. It belonged to a private in one of the New York regiments and was found by the side of a Federal soldier as he lay dead the morning after the battle. The barrel bears the marks, it is supposed, of several bayonet thrusts and saber cuts, and at one end is the impression of a cannonball, which has bent and twisted it terribly. It can be seen in our office." And so the love of artifacts, really began right as the war was starting. And to give you an idea of what This is a Civil War musket that was in my collection. I would dug it at a Union campsite in Vicksburg, and I have since donated it to the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum down at Camp Shelby. Hopefully it'll be on display there one of these days, and you'll be able to see it firsthand. But relics like this were very common, and people, I think Americans have always loved war souvenirs. Every war we've been in, people have collected artifacts related to that war, and the Civil War was no different. Now, at times, war soldiers took items from the enemy as plunder or just as souvenir hunting, but in some cases, the items in question were taken to satisfy a debt of honor between brother Masons. In this case, one rebel and one Yankee. The following story was published in the Vicksburg Daily Herald, August 4th, 1864, and it's titled A Masonic Incident. And it states, "We are told the following circumstances in regard to the death of Lieutenant Tinkham, who was killed in the Second Battle of Corinth. It appears that Lieutenant Tinkham was not seriously wounded when the rebels took possession of that part of the field where he fell, but was only shot through the leg, and as our boys were contesting the advance of the enemy with desperate bravery, Lieutenant Tinkham raised himself upon the elbow to see the fighting, when another leaden messenger pierced his body, and he fell to the ground again. Seeing that he must soon be numbered among the slain, and that his lifeblood was fast flowing out, he made the grand hailing sign to a passing rebel, who immediately came to Tinkham's side, and rendered him all assistance in his power." And just to give you a little background, in case you're not familiar, Masons are duty-bound to come to the aid of a fellow Mason, whether they be an enemy soldier or not. And when Lieutenant Tinkham, who served in the 14th Wisconsin Infantry, gave the Masonic sign of distress, a Confederate soldier saw that and felt duty-bound to come to his aid because he was a brother Mason. And the article went on to say that just before he expired, he handed the rebel his watch and some money, and with the instructions to forward it to his family the first opportunity he had, and a few moments after expired. Time rolls on, and on the 4th of July, 35,000 rebels surrendered to our victorious army at Vicksburg, and among that vast multitude we find Lieutenant Tinkham's friend eagerly searching for the 14th Wisconsin Regiment. He found the regiment and safely delivered the watch and money to one of its members and disappeared among the throng. The articles have been received by Mr. Tinkham's friends in this county. And the man that he's talking about, the Union soldier who entrusted his worldly possessions to an enemy soldier, was First Lieutenant Samuel Tinkham. He served in Company B of the 14th Wisconsin Infantry, and he was indeed mortally wounded at the Battle of Corinth. This is a casualty report from the Battle of Corinth, and Lieutenant Samuel A. Tinkham is listed among the killed of Company B. At his death, he was 34 years old. He left behind a wife, Mary, and a 1-year-old daughter, Luella. His wife, Mary, lived just long enough to file for a pension, and unfortunately she passed away on January 4th, 1863. And the child, Luella, was taken in by her mother's parents. And fortunately, I was able to find out a little bit about the child, and she did survive the war and lived to a nice old age. I think she died in the 1940s. But the illustration from the newspaper is from the Wisconsin State Journal, October 27th, 1862. Now, the Oshkosh Public Museum in Wisconsin has in its collection a letter written by Colonel John Hancock, who was the commander of the 14th Wisconsin Infantry, and he actually mentioned Lieutenant Tinkham in one of his letters. In fact, he said, I had Lieutenant Tinkham promoted for bravery at Shiloh. He was a very fine, principled, quiet young man, brave and liked by all. Such, my darling, are the vicissitudes of our war, some to glory and some to the grave." And I think that's just a really poetic way to put it. Now, when the war ended in 1865, peace returned to Mississippi, but the debris of dozens of battles just littered the landscape for years thereafter. And in some cases, this debris could be quite deadly. In fact, there was an article in the Vicksburg Daily Herald, April 23rd, 1868, that explained and had a big headline that wrote, "Killed. We are informed that 2 men of a prying turn of mind who were endeavoring to pry off the cap of an unexploded shell were blown into eternity on yesterday evening near the residence of Mr. Henry Hammett. We do not mean that the residence of Mr. Hammett is anywhere in the neighborhood of eternity, but we are of the opinion that the men imagine they are now, yet when last seen, they and the shell were near Mr. Hammett's." And this was not uncommon. You see a lot of these kinds of articles after the war of people being accidentally killed by the thousands of pieces of unexploded ordnance that littered the countryside. What you see here in this picture is just a little bit of the captured Confederate ordnance that the Federals had stacked up at A.B. Redding's foundry down by the river in Vicksburg. And for years thereafter, you would read these kinds of accounts of these shells going off if somebody haphazardly played around with them. In fact, another story that was in a similar vein, although with less fatal results, was published in the Vicksburg Daily Herald on February 7th, 1872. And it was headlined, "Explosion at Jackson." At about 8 o'clock last evening, a loud explosion was heard in the western part of the city, which caused some to think that a steam boiler had collapsed a flue, or that the Federal troops were once more bombarding Jackson. It appears that a blast was being melted at the Excelsior Foundry in West Jackson, and among the old iron placed in the cupola were 2 shrapnel shells, relics of the late unpleasantness, which had been purchased by the proprietors at the foundry to transform into more useful and certainly more oriental materials. The shells were supposed to be as harmless as cast iron, lions at a park gate, or sleeping sculptured lambs on a tombstone, but they chanced to be loaded, and when sufficiently heated, went off. Fortunately, no one was killed. And that was very fortunate because throwing a live shell into a blast furnace is a good way to get somebody killed. And then not all relic-related stories in the immediate post-war period were so explosive in nature. Another article published in the Vicksburg Daily Herald on March 5th, 1868 was simply concerned with an interesting artifact from the siege of Vicksburg. And it noted, "During the siege of Vicksburg, it is reported that 2 balls, one a Mini and the other from a Belgian rifle, fired from opposite points, met in midair and were almost completely welded together." And this happened from time to time. There was so much lead being thrown back and forth between the Union and Confederate lines that it was inevitable that sooner or later 2 bullets were going to hit. And this example I found was from the Battle of Fredericksburg, but the ones that they're talking about that happened at the Siege of Vicksburg would have been very similar. And you see these kinds of artifacts from battles all over the country. When you've got literally thousands upon thousands of bullets being thrown into the air at the same time, sooner or later a couple of them are going to hit. And I can only imagine what that must have sounded like. Probably be pretty cool to hear, actually. Now, among the most moving artifacts to be reported were those found when lost graves of soldiers were accidentally disturbed. And there was an article from the Atlanta Constitution that was saved by Sophie Goodrum of Vicksburg in her scrapbook, and it illustrates the reverence that Southerners had for the relics that belonged to fallen soldiers. And it wrote, "Who are they? Photographs buried in a fallen soldier's grave." And it literally included pictures of 2 photographs that were found in a Confederate soldier's grave when some of the Atlanta defenses were being dug up after the war. And this happened on battlefields all over the country, and it happened at Vicksburg. In fact, this photo that you see here is from a soldier's grave that was dug up in the Vicksburg National Military Park while they were doing some earth moving in 1936. And there have been a number of Civil War soldiers that have been found over the years in the Vicksburg area by accident just while earth moving has been done. And that is not uncommon at all. And the article that was mentioned in Sophie Goodrum's scrapbook even included pictures of the actual photographs that were found in the grave. And this is them. And it just says, "Who are they? Photographs buried in a fallen soldier's grave." And the two pictures printed herewith tell a pathetic story. As explained in the letter accompanying them, there are copies of the faces in an old daguerreotype found in an unmarked grave, the last resting place of one of the South's brave defenders, who is now classed a member of the great army of the unknown dead. I thought that was very touching. And that was not uncommon either, to find photographs in a grave. Very often soldiers did carry photographs of their loved ones with them, and sometimes those photographs were buried. And it's surprising how well some of those photographs would survive, even being buried for a number of years. Now, there was so much iron and lead strewn across the landscape around Vicksburg that some enterprising locals actually were able to make a lively business of selling it. A great example here is the business of Z.M. Davis, who ran what was called the National Park Store, which was literally located just outside the boundary of the Vicksburg National Military Park near the Illinois Monument. And Davis sold gasoline, general merchandise, and Civil War relics. And in fact, one newspaper article from a New Orleans paper wrote that a great many relics of the war still continue to be picked up on the whole battlefields near Vicksburg, and there is hardly a day passes that a local junk dealer does not buy quantities of lead bullets. To give something of the idea of the amount of lead the Yanks rained down upon the city, the books show that he has bought and shipped some 75 tons of leaden bullets, not including shell, solid shot, etc., and he did not enter the business until 2 or 3 years after the larger portion of the trade was over, and some half a dozen other establishments in the city buying at the same time, and still the supply is not exhausted. Now, that was from the New Orleans Times, October 3rd, 1877. And this is also from the collection of Z.M. Davis. Just adjacent to his store, he actually had a huge collection of Civil War artillery shells with the helpful sign saying, "Do not handle, dangerous." And they most certainly were, because almost all of those were explosive shell that were still live, that had not gone off. So over the years after Davis passed away, I think all of those shells were disposed of, hopefully properly. But this gives you an idea of just how much ordnance was left laying around Vicksburg. That's just a tiny little collection there of just one man. And as the years went by and the 19th century gave way to the 20th century, time took its toll on the surviving Civil War veterans, and by the third decade of the new century, there were only a handful of the old soldiers left in Vicksburg. While most of the men who had fought for the Hill City were gone, there were many tangible reminders left behind of the fighting that they had done. And the sheer quantity of artifacts in Vicksburg at this time was documented at great length by V. Blaine Russell, a columnist for the Vicksburg Evening Post, who wrote for the newspaper from the 1930s up to the 1950s. And I know one of his favorite topics were the Civil War caves that still dotted the landscape as late as the 1930s. And in fact, this great picture is of Mr. Tom Lewis, who was a little boy during the siege of Vicksburg, and he's posed out in front of the cave that his family sheltered in during the war. And in fact, you can see in the entrance there, he's got a number of shells lining the entrance. But he made a tourist stop out of this cave and charged people to go through it, which was quite enterprising of him, I must say. And Mr. V. Blaine Russell, and this is his picture, he wrote for the Vicksburg Evening Post for many years, and he very often would write about Civil War artifacts that he ran across in his rambles around town. And he literally did ramble because he didn't own a car, and so he literally walked everywhere he was going unless he could hitchhike with a friend. Now, this is another example of a really big relic. This is a Civil War cannon that was found at the base of the Castle Battery Hill. During the occupation of Vicksburg, the Federals had an artillery battery up on Castle Hill. After the siege was over, they got rid of the artillery, and they got rid of this particular artillery piece by dumping it off at the side of the hill. And in 1936, some of the locals who still remembered where it was at recovered it, and that cannon is out in the Vicksburg National Military Park today. And stuff like, it's just amazing to think that there were just cannon lying around, but there were, I mean, the amount of artifacts still laying about in the 1930s and 40s kind of boggles the mind. In fact, V. Blaine Russell wrote in one of his columns, went again on a lone investigation of the spot where lately we dredged out 106 mini balls and fragments of shrapnel. This last time we found 14 more bullets and 5 fragments of shrapnel in the same hole. We theorize now that perhaps this cache of missiles got into one spot because Confederates were being shot at there as they came down to the water hole to fill their canteens, or perhaps some soldier died there and his load of ammunition settled about his body. And artillery shells were so common in the city that Mr. Russell noted, in Vicksburg, cannonball gate and doorway ornaments are not unusual. You see them in many places. Sometimes they are well matched. Again, they are not. There is a well-balanced quadruplet of missiles on the Collier front lawn at Speed in Washington. 2 of them are big mortar shells, the other 2 bullet-shaped missiles. And this was written by Mr. Russell in February of 1937. And, you know, time marches on, as it inevitably does, and the 20th century gave way to the 21st. Civil War relics may not be as plentiful as they once were, but I can testify from personal experience that they still can be found in the Vicksburg area. For example, this U.S. Cartridge box plate. I dug that many years ago now, back in, 1999, at the site of a skirmish known as the Battle of Hills Plantation that took place outside of Vicksburg. And, you know, I think as long as these tangible reminders in brass and lead keep coming out of the ground, stories are going to be written about them, and they're going to remind us of a time really not that long ago when brother fought against brother in Mississippi. And these are a few more of my artifacts that I dug over the years. A nice little collection of Civil War bullets, a few other associated pieces. These are some bullets from the Civil War that I dug down at Port Gibson. I particularly like the 2 mini balls that were beaten flat. Soldiers often did that probably for use as gaming pieces. Just a nice little tangible reminder of what soldiers did during their downtime. But that kind of brings this episode to an end. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've never owned a Civil War artifact, go out and buy a Civil War bullet or a piece of canister shot or a button. They don't cost very much, and it really is, if you've got anyone in your family that's interested in the Civil War, it's a really great tangible reminder of the war that they can look at and actually hold in their hand. You can look at this bullet and think, who was the last soldier to have this before he lost it? It's just, I think they're really cool ways to remember the war. And before I go, I mentioned in the last episode I was going to have a giveaway. Well, it is time to tell you about that. In the latest issue of the Artilleryman magazine, volume 43, number 2, which is a spring 2022 issue, I have an article about Old Saratoga, which was a cannon given to the city of Natchez by Andrew Jackson in 1815. It was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and the people of Natchez kept it all the way up through the Civil War. In fact, it has an interesting little Civil War history as well. Well, when the article came out, the editor sent me a number of complimentary issues, and I want to pass a few of these along. So I'm going to give away a couple of them, and I'll even autograph them for you if you're so inclined. And the only thing you need to do to be entered into the drawing for one of these free magazines, please subscribe to my channel. like this particular video, and leave a comment just saying that you want to be in the raffle for the giveaway. That's all you have to do. Just like, subscribe, comment. And I wish you the best of luck. I'll be giving these away in the next episode, which will be in about a week's time. And I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to bringing you the next one. Thank you very much.